Ambassador John Bolton here, of course, represented us very well at the United Nations. Before we get to you, Ambassador, I do want you to react to this. The president, in his first sort of opening salvo at the United Nations, kind of zinging them, but in a nice way, to say that they've not reached their full potential. Take a look.
In recent years, the United Nations has not reached its full potential because of bureaucracy and mismanagement. While the United Nations on a regular budget has increased by 140% and its staff has more than doubled since 2000, we are not seeing the results in line with this investment.
All right, Ambassador John Bolton.
Glad to be with you. Well, I think the only reform that will make any difference at the United Nations, and I speak from 25 years of experience and failure at trying to fix it, the only reform that works is changing the funding mechanism. As you might expect, it's sort of a Wall Street approach. Right now, we pay 22% of most UN agency budgets, 25% for peacekeeping, automatic. Whatever the budget is, we pay 22%. It's like a tax on the United States. That has to change. Instead of assessed or mandatory contributions, we should contribute whatever we want if we think the money's being well spent. Sometimes we may contribute 0% of somebody's budget. Sometimes we may consider...
But is that a fixed amount every year?
No, it goes up every year.
Okay, so
but it's 22%.
Does it go up for other countries, or do the percentages stay the same?
The percentages are modified from time to time, but we are far and away the biggest country. Japan second at about 17%. They would join with us, I think, in an aggressive campaign to say, contribute what you want. You countries that think the United Nations is so wonderful, Mrs. Merkel in Germany, you give about 12, 13% now. Contribute 20% if you think it's so great.
I don't see that making
What a surprise. What a surprise. No, we just ought to do it unilaterally, and they'll get around to catching up.
Let's switch gears a little bit on what the president might or might not say regarding North Korea tomorrow. What can he offer? I mean, if we've said the time for talk is over, this has drawn the line, and all of a sudden we keep saying with every missile launch that there are more emergency talks and they don't really change the behavior. What can he say?
Well, I think in both Iran and North Korea cases, he needs to lay out what the American argument is clearly once and for all, because part of the problem is his government is divided, and divided in public. And I think this sends a very mixed message around the world, but particularly to North Korea and China in this case, which are the two principal audiences. Look, yesterday, Secretary of State Tillerson said on Face the Nation that the pressure we're applying on North Korea is to get them to the table for constructive, productive dialogue. That's not going to do any good after 25 years of trying. This morning in the New York Times, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan, in a remarkable op-ed, says, and I quote, "More dialogue with North Korea would be a dead end." Absolutely right. And he goes on to say, basically, if the United States decides to use force, he's with us. So we've got a stronger position from the Prime Minister of Japan.
What is force to you, Ambassador? I mean, is it shooting down a missile and its launch? Is it... What is it?
Well, the question, the preliminary question before you get to the use of force is, what is acceptable to us as citizens of the United States? Susan Rice, Obama's national security advisor, wrote her own op-ed about a month or so ago saying we should accept North Korea with nuclear weapons. I absolutely reject that. I do not think we should live under fear of this bizarre regime blackmailing us in the future, selling these weapons to Iran or other rogue states.
Risk? I think what she was getting at, and not to be apologist there, but is it worth going to war for something that might be inevitable? You don't want to make it inevitable, of course, but would Americans be willing to do that?
Polls show that they are, and the question a president has to ask is, how do I best protect Americans? Or put more bluntly, how many dead Americans am I prepared to risk?
And if he doesn't do that, that's something you would face, right?
I think we have North Korea and Iran and others threatening us forever. You know, there's a kind of propaganda line out there that North Korea and Iran really only want nuclear weapons because they fear attack, and this is their ultimate defense. That's not true. What does North Korea want with nuclear weapons? It wants South Korea. That's what it wants. And it can use these weapons.
But it must have a survival instinct, right? Because they're not total clueless asses, right? I mean, they must realize that the more saber rattling they do, the more they risk you know, getting into conflict with the United States. And that's a no-win game for anyone.
So far, they haven't gotten into conflict with us, have they? And they have a president in South Korea who wants more sunshine with North Korea. So if, let's say next year, they have a capability to drop thermonuclear weapons on any city in the United States, and they say, take your troops out of South Korea, stop providing sophisticated weapons to South Korea, take your troops out of Japan, out of Guam, you name it, or we will use nuclear weapons. What will the United States do at that point? That's how they use the weapons as levers to get what they want.
Your fear, again, and it goes back to what Susan Rice has said, you know, rogue or, let's say, nations deemed to be unstable, like Pakistan, that have this nuclear capability, we grudgingly accept it and live in a world where it's the case.
I do not grudgingly accept it. And I don't agree with what I think is a dangerously facile analogy to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Number one, we barely escaped nuclear conflagration on several occasions in the Cold War. Number two, I don't want to go back to those happy days where we were doing duck and cover drills in elementary school. I don't want our children and grandchildren to do that. And finally, and most compellingly of all, North Korea is not the Kremlin leadership during the Cold War. It is rational in its own sense, but it's in a bizarre world. And I would say the Ayatollahs in Tehran, religious extremists, are in an even different kind of world. So the risk that North Korea poses is not just a direct challenge vis-a-vis us, it's selling their weapons to Iran, selling them to Hezbollah or anybody for hard currency. If we don't stop proliferation in North Korea and Iran, we're not going to stop it anywhere.
All right. John Bolton, scary stuff. But again, all of this is playing out as you kind of eerily predicted. John Bolton, our former UN ambassador.